We'll ask each other questions.
I'd like to ask Amina if she could say a little bit more about how she sees women, Muslim women, and relating to women in other cultures and in other traditions, while respecting their differences, but also recognizing the need for enhancing their equality and their dignity in the world as a whole.
Well, that's a very complicated question, Father Lawrence.
You can simplify it.
But I am lucky because I am a Muslim woman born and grown up in Southeast Asia, where women have had a unrestricted development in society. It has not been unusual in Southeast Asia to have women leaders, women in business, but all of those started changing when you had very fundamentalist, very orthodox missionaries coming into Southeast Asia, when the oil-rich Middle East countries started having money to spend to propagate Islam. And they brought with them their own brand, their own interpretation of Islam. And on the face of it, control of women, what we wear, what we can do, what we can be, can we go to school, which was relatively not a barrier in Southeast Asia before the advent of this particular strain of Islamic thought, as you will. So we in Southeast Asia have been lucky. When we started seeing the realities in the Middle East and what was happening to our sisters, we had always thought that it would have been a much more fruitful initiative if the United Nations and the other countries who were so concerned with women's roles, it would have been better if they had brought the Middle East women leaders to Southeast Asia to see how we had managed our own developments. We were all Muslims, so faith would not be a factor, but we were able to strike out in society and do well. So internally, we needed our own intra-faith dialogues, if you will, on women's role. And part of this is really pushing our clerics, our ulama, our scholars, to really look more into the historical background of the Sharia laws that they cite, which restrict women. I think there has been debates about this. There has been ijtihad about the issue of women's rights and women's roles in society. So that's one part of the question. The other one, when we're talking now about Muslim women and non-Muslim women, particularly women from the West, they look at us and they see that they see us as meek and mild and unable to stand up for ourselves, battered into submission, if you will. But that is far from the truth. And again, we have to show what's going on in Southeast Asia. True, we do have large pockets of marginalized women, but we also have very aggressive women in civil society, women in business, women in politics. So there has got to be this dialogue too between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world about the reality of women's roles. And we have to be prepared to listen to what the other side is saying and not immediately go in there, be very aggressive and defend our position. For that is the beauty of dialogue, that we listen to the other and then we come up to common agreements and an understanding about what the truth is. And then maybe we can move forward.
Thank you. That's very encouraging. Very encouraging.
Father Lawrence, if I might ask a question. You've been looking at how religious fundamentalism has been on the rise in Europe and the United States. And if you could advise the leaders of the West, what would be the most efficacious, I guess, the most effective way for them to put the brakes on this unhealthy development dividing our societies?
Well, that's a complicated question too. I asked Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore some years ago. He had started, he'd learned to meditate. He wasn't a religious person, but he was a very good student of meditation in the last years of his life. And I asked him once, in fact, we made a film in which I asked him, Mr. Lee, would you advise the leaders of the world when they come together to meditate at their meetings? And he looked at me as this rather naive monk, and he said, smiled, and he said, well, I don't think they would be very likely to meditate when they come together for these meetings. And I said, no, I didn't say, did you think they would? I said, I asked you, would you advise them to? And he thought about the question, and then he said, yes, I would. And then he described how he himself had made his contemplative practice, his times of meditation every day, integral to his life. And he said, when I have a very difficult decision to make, he said, during the day, I stop and meditate. And I would advise the leaders of the world to meditate together. And he said, if there is any danger of violence being the outcome of their meetings, I would say meditate for a long time together. So I think now, I think the way in which we can counteract the fundamentalism that is often a politicized, cynical, and really dark, it's an abuse of religion. And you know, the way the American Christian right was groomed, and it's a kind of abuse. And once it has happened, it is very difficult to reverse. It becomes a monstrous deformation of religion. So I don't know. It has given rise to what we're all familiar with today as this polarized world of opinions.
Yes.
And the social media. There's a wonderful prophetic film called The Social Dilemma, which is made from the young experts who created social media in Silicon Valley 10, 15 years ago. And they are now waking up in the same way that the scientists woke up to the dangers of atomic power. They are now aware of what they have created. And it's a monster that is very difficult for us. And one of them was asked, what do you see as the outcome of this polarization that happened? And he said, civil war.
Yes.
So how do you deal with a polarized, fundamentalist, religious environment? I think argument, rational argument, even an invitation to dialogue is often not effective. And I was once with a group of Christians actually it was in Asia, and they'd asked me to speak to them about meditation. And when they heard that I had had dialogue with the Dalai Lama, some of them, many of them just turned off. I was a pariah. I was, I'd betrayed Christ. And they said, dialogue is not part of our Christian approach. So I think, how do you deal with that? You can't deal with it with rational argument. Of course, you don't give up rational argument. But I think we have to develop a very, very strong contemplative mind that is able to engage with these forces of fundamentalism and overcome what we cannot overcome by rational argument or even dialogue. I think we really need a very big wave of the spirit.
Yes.
To raise the level of contemplative consciousness.
Absolutely.
I don't know if
Professor Wadi had something to say or ask. Professor Wadi?
Yes. I'd like to ask question also to Father Lawrence. In fact, he could correct me if I'm wrong. The attempt of WCCM to popularize or retrieve contemplative spirituality is not new. Perhaps Father Lawrence could educate us the early traditions of so-called the Gnostic Christians. I read somewhere that there used to be what is called as Gnostic Gospels. And there were early Christians who were actually spiritual, and they were deep in their practice of spirituality, meditation, and so on. But there was a twist of history somewhere that lead into the in a sense, the ostracization of the Christian mystics in those times, even prohibiting them in participating in the public discourses. What happened in those times, and how would this development, in a sense, square off with what happened with the church? In other words, are we now true and true with such twists of history in terms of the full reception of spiritual tradition, contemplative practice among the early Christians? So I'd like to ask Father Lawrence to help me on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Wadi. I'll make a short response, but I'd like to ask Cardinal Cavido to respond to that as well. I think it's even when you go back to the New Testament, the earliest Christian scriptures, you see a lot of diversity in theology and in practice from the very beginning. The idea that there was some kind of golden age where everybody agreed with each other theologically is a bit of a dream, I think. So we have to learn how to live with diversity and differences of opinion. And the Gnostic movement is quite a complicated historical phenomenon. I don't think one can just polarize polarize it as the institutional church fighting with the good Gnostics, you know, and the institutional church repressed them. I think there was a struggle, and there was certainly some terrible repressions, as there have been in Islam, in some parts of Islam, of Sufism. The mystical aspect of religion is often threatening to the institutional aspect. There are three dimensions of religion. There's the intellectual, the institutional, and the mystical. And these three often do get into conflict with each other, and they require great leadership. One of the things that we need, especially today, is great leadership. So I think historically there was a conflict theologically and sometimes violently with some of the Gnostic movements, but it wasn't only to repress them, it was also to refine and protect the simple heart of the New Testament revelation, and to affirm this, the great paradox, which is of course at the heart of Christian faith, the incarnation. So, but I think there's a truth in what you suggest also, that after the end of the age of persecution of Christianity, when Christianity became not only a recognized religion, but actually became collaborating, became a collaborator with the Roman Empire, and later the successor of the Roman Empire in Europe, then this led to great complexity. On the one hand, you had the ability to be able to communicate freely and to form new ways of life, and the religious life, the monastic life, new institutions, schools, hospitals, and so on, out of Christian faith. That was a wonderful development. But the danger, of course, was power, and power can corrupt. And it's not black and white, because there was good and bad in it. But that age of Christianity is over now. Christendom, you know, this idea of a kind of a society that was totally controlled by the church, Western society, and where sharing the gospel meant forcing people to convert. That is over. That period of history is over, and Christianity is entering, like other religions, into a death experience, from which I believe it will rise again in new forms. And the thread that we can see continuing all the way through from the New Testament period to our own day is the transmission of mystical wisdom. And I think Christianity, that is what allows Christianity, and indeed other religions, to evolve, to die in certain forms, and to be reborn. Painful. We all know from our personal lives that dying and moving into a new form of life is very painful. But maybe Cardinal Quevedo, could you address that?
I would like to, maybe it's an oversimplification, but the mystical tradition in the church began with Jesus, contemplative tradition. And Jesus himself would go many times into the desert, into the wilderness, to commune with God, spend the whole night in prayer. And one of his apostles was known to be a mystic, St. John. So you have this mystical tradition beginning in the New Testament with Jesus himself, followed up by early Christianity, particularly the Eastern Christianity. They are more of the contemplative type than the Western. although there are religious orders who are in Western Christianity that are devoted to prayer and contemplation. These are the monks, the Trappists, and the Cistercians. These are contemplatives, and they go back to they inherit the legacy of the early church of mystical contemplation. And then came those who wanted to blend prayer and contemplation with action, with ministry, and the religious orders of the Dominicans and the Jesuits came because of that, and they're called the contemplative agents. Agent contemplative, contemplativus agens, they say in Latin. But even now, you have that tradition coming up. What was wrong with the Gnostics, it's obvious oversimplification, is not their contemplative tradition. It was their heretical doctrines that got them into conflict with the institutional church. And you find this kind of contemplative tradition in the Middle Ages that went into conflict because of heresies or inordinate beliefs. The begins in the Middle Ages. Those were also those who wanted to go back to the original poverty of the church, and then contemplation, prayer. But they went into conflict because of erroneous doctrines. So you have to distinguish between true contemplation and the doctrine that urged them on for that. The second one that I would like to comment on, if I would be women. You know, the great paradigm for interreligious dialogue of Jesus was of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Here is a Jew talking with a woman, unheard of, and not only a woman, but Samaritan from another religion. They worship differently from on another mountain, and the Jews also worship differently. And the disciples were aghast when they saw Jesus talking with a woman and Samaritan. Here is Jesus himself breaking the barriers between men and women in the Jewish times, And that is a tradition that Jesus began. And here we have now Amina looking at the role of women being a Muslim and how it interrelates with Christians, with Christian women. And the third comment is about fundamentalism. Our Muslim scholar from Malaysia wrote once that he thinks of religious fundamentalism of the ISIS not so much as religious. It is ideological, being supported by selected verses from the Quran, but it is mainly ideological. And I think I agree with him. Religious fundamentalism is basically ideological rather than religious.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very clear. Professor Wadi, could I turn that question that you raised back to you, just with one further response to what you said. I think that the apocryphal Gospels, which were mostly written in the second, third or later centuries, are now coming back into Christian spiritual reading. And I think like the Gospel of Thomas, for example, very powerful, and the scholars recognize it as much of it as a genuine source. However, when I read the four Gospels, I think they are incomparable. they whereas the Gnostic Gospels often have a point to make, it's as if the four main Gospels just sort of show something or reveal something and demand that the reader or the listener interprets them for themselves. So it's different. I'm always amazed at the difference between them. But I agree with you that some of those Gnostic Gospels are of great spiritual value. But could you say something about the mystical dimension of Islam, especially with regard to the Sufi wisdom, which I love, and which has become, fortunately, much better known in the Western world generally in recent years, you know, through translations of Rumi and a wonderful television series which was made in Turkey called Yunus Emre, the great Sufi poet of Turkey, and which I'm watching for the second time. It's amazing communication of a mystical tradition, you know, through a television series. But anyway, could you tell us something about the place of Sufism in contemporary Islam?
Yeah, let me divide my answer into two, Father Lawrence. I'd like to comment on your first impressions on the Gnostic gospel. In fact, if I may relate an experience, I was once invited by a center at the University of Santo Tomas, one of the oldest universities in the world, to deliver a lecture on Mary in the Quran as a counterpart to another lecturer's topic, Mary in the Bible. I did a few research on this subject, and I was able to access some what may be considered as apocryphal sources about Mary, but which are not obviously included in the story about Mary in the Bible. I realized that there is even strong symmetry between the Quran's perspective of Mary with those apocryphal sources, you know, that you mentioned earlier. That's why I'm quite concerned with learning more about Gnostic Gospels, because if the church, as mentioned by Cardinal Quevedo, had declared them as heretical, that should be, I think, subject of even deeper examination. Who's saying who? As far as heresy is concerned, given that, in a sense, the Gnostics in the early days were closer to the periods of Jesus. Therefore, in terms of knowledge transmission, they probably have more in their hands, some level of truth compared to the succeeding generations of Christians. The implications of what I'm saying, Father Lawrence, is that, you know, in the Philippines, for instance, the late Father Bulatao has this powerful term when he said that Filipinos suffer from what he calls split Christianity. He seems to suggest that Filipinos are only religious or spiritual inside the church, but they are not when they are outside the church. They would go back and do their own ways outside of the teachings of the church, let alone the teachings of Jesus. So I see polarization. On one hand, we project religiosity and spirituality amongst our people, but in truth is that that division is only sort of monopolized in the church. But I think the idea of contemplative spirituality is that this is so empowering that if only Christians or Filipinos, in particular, would realize that they have, in fact, the way, the method into which they could approach God, you know, and therefore they will be religious even outside of the church or outside of a structure, then it is so empowering that they will become more Christians, and therefore, you know, the idea of Father Bulatao of split Christianity would be resolved. So that's the implications of that point Father Lawrence raised, the idea of, you know, retrieving Christian traditions of contemplative practice. Now, with respect to Islamic experience, it's a totally different context, but I think there was also some history of persecutions. We have to remember that in Islamic thought, there are at least three major strands. One is the strand of theology, wherein you will find here different schools, orthodox schools, with which they claim that the main source of knowledge is the revelation. So you'll find here the different schools, the Shafi'i school, the Hanbali school, the Maliki school, and many others. And you'll find here doctrines, and so on. That's one strand. The second strand is the philosophical tradition. Then you have another set of schools, and you have here great philosophers like Ibn Sina, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, and so on. And they have contributed in one way or the other, or another, in the Enlightenment, in even serving Islamic philosophy, serving as a bridge between Greek philosophy and what we now know as Western philosophy. And the source of knowledge, according to this tradition, is akal, or reason. That's the second strand. The third strand is, this is what your question is all about, the Sufi strand, or the mystical tradition. There's a very rich discourses on mysticism, including spiritual orders and great personalities of Tasawwuf or Sufism, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Al-Hallaj, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jailani, and so on and so forth. And their main focus as source of knowledge is what we call the idea of unveiling, or kasaf. The idea of kasaf, or unveiling, is that accordingly, if one wishes to reach, or at least be in nearness with God, he has to engage in unveiling. That is to say that one has to struggle to unveil the lights that separate man from God, the Creator. And according to tradition, specific traditions of the Prophet, that there are 70,000 lights that separate man from God. So therefore, to penetrate those lights, one has to engage in unveiling. It is like removing, layers of curtain, one after another. And here man should engage in a quest. That was great Sufis, from Al-Hallaj, Abdul Qadir Jailani, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, even contemporaries like Sayyid Nursi, were all engaged in a spiritual quest, and they have their own way of transcending. And also, as I consider myself as a student of Christian literature, one of my favorite works is Saint Teresa's of Avila's spiritual tradition, particularly her concepts of prayer of the quiet. And Saint Teresa identified 4 steps in the quest if individual or person would like to elevate or soar in the process of what I call Jihad Akbar. I think Father Quevedo knows more of this, but what I can say is there's great symmetry of early Gnostic amongst Christians, including the succeeding Gnostics and mystics, also among Christians, priests and nuns, including contemporary ones. And I would consider you, Father Lawrence, as one of the proponents of these Gnostic traditions. I can only say of the symmetry, the convergence of mystical traditions of both Islam and Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was. We should continue this dialogue. Maybe Dr. Marites, would you like to?
I believe, Father, excuse me, I think Yusuf, Datu Yusuf.
I'm sorry.
And then we'll proceed to Marites. Datu
Yes,
Yusuf.
thank you for the opportunity to share and in this gathering. Father Lawrence, I have 2 questions for you. The first question actually is centered on, you have mentioned Yunus Emre. Have you, on a personal note, been invited to experience Hadra? Hadra is, of course, the circle of gathering of Sufis where certain incantations are done, or in a zikr gathering? And have you been, if so, what was your personal reflection and experience of it? The second question is, Saint John of the Cross has been one of the major foundational pillars of spirituality in Catholic contemplative practices. Does he have any spiritual heirloom? Like, for example, among the Muslims, we have what we call the munajat, the whispered prayers, which Dean Wadi has been mentioned as the prayers of the quiet. So do you have something that is similar to the munajat, that is a process of soulful whispered worship towards God, and how do you do it? I hope both the Honorable Cardinal and Father Lawrence would share on this matter. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, in response to your first question, no, I haven't been to a zikr a gathering as such. I've participated in some of the turnings, the turning, the dervishes, but not in the zikr gathering. So maybe if I come to Mindanao, you can take me to one, because I would love to. And I do think that that series on Yunus Emre, as a monk, I find it very fascinating to see the comparison between the Sufi lodges and a Christian monastery, how much they have in common, but also how distinct they are. And I think in all forms of organized contemplative community life, there is a structure which has to integrate, and this answers your second, or responds to your second question, there is a structure which should integrate the prayer of the heart with the external forms of worship. And one of the tragedies, really, I think, of history has been that in the Christian monastic tradition, we lost that connection between the practice of contemplative prayer and the celebration of the divine office, of liturgical prayer, the Eucharist. and the divine office, so the vocal prayers and the ritual prayers. And in our community here at Bonneveau, I'm at our international center here in France at Bonneveau, which was a 12th century monastery in which we are renovating, and it's the center of our global family. Here we continue the integration of times of contemplative practice with the times of the office, what we call the divine office, or the chanting of the Psalms, and of course the celebration of the Eucharist. And we do it in a very simple way. We see the office as a preparation of the mind and heart, a calming of the mind and heart through the Word of God, to prepare us for a half hour of meditation, by which I mean the prayer of the heart, very similar, of course, to zikr. And similarly at the Mass, as we do here every time we celebrate Mass, and whenever we're on retreat, we integrate a period of meditation, silent meditation, after the moment of communion. So it can be done, and it's done easily. You can maybe make some adjustments, but basically these do not exclude each other. So in response to your other question about, is there a tradition of this form of contemplative prayer, the whispering of the name of God in Christianity? Yes, there is, and that's what our community is committed to practicing and teaching, and to helping to restore this dimension of prayer, which is a lost dimension, as the Cardinal was saying, particularly in the Latin Church, in the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, they never lost this awareness of the prayer of the heart, even if they didn't practice it, but they always understood it and knew it, and it was their goal. But in the Latin Church, it became restricted to contemplative communities, something maybe even elitist or esoteric. So we, and with other contemplative communities, are working to reintegrate, restore the practice of contemplative prayer into the ordinary life of the Christian, of Christian spirituality. We take our inspiration from, of course, the teaching of Jesus on prayer in the Gospel of Matthew, where he tells us to go into our inner room. He tells us not to talk too much. He tells us not to concentrate upon our problems. Do not worry, he says. He tells us to pay attention, set your mind on God's kingdom. And he tells us to be in the present moment, not to worry about tomorrow. So Jesus is a teacher of contemplation. When he speaks about prayer, he doesn't speak about external forms of prayer, liturgy. He speaks about the prayer of the heart. Then the second source of practical inspiration we have for our work and this tradition is from the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the early Christian monks. And we should never forget that the early monastic movement was a lay movement. It wasn't Saint Benedict himself was not a priest, in fact. It was a lay movement. And this is of great importance for the church in allowing or in encouraging lay people to become contemplatives. And that's the solution. We all are contemplatives. It's not just people living in Sufi lodges or in monasteries. We are all contemplatives. This was the great insight of the Second Vatican Council. So we follow the wisdom teaching from the desert tradition of the 3rd, 4th centuries, which spread throughout the church, which John Main, the founder of our community, recognized and sort of extracted and represented in a contemporary way. But we follow exactly that teaching, taking a sacred word, a verse of scripture, and repeating it continuously, faithfully in the mind and heart. And that idea of the repetition of a name of God, or the repetition of a sacred verse, is of course to be found in all of the great traditions.
Marites, do you have any question or a comment? Additional comment?
Thank you. Yes.
Excuse me, Cardinal Quevedo was also asked by Yusuf.
Okay, sorry, Marites, sorry, Cardinal.
Right. Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila worked together to renew the Carmelite order, and their mystical tradition was passed on to the Spanish Carmelites, and it was practiced by the Carmelites in Spain for a long time. But today there is a new movement of trying to reinterpret the mystical tradition of Avila and John of the Cross into our situation now, and not only religious orders, but also lay people. There are two aspects of this. That there was a famous American, I forgot his name, but he came to give a seminar to priests, religious, and lay people on centering prayer. Centering prayer, he called it. It is a prayer that leads to suddenly no thought, just no thinking. All thought is eliminated in this centering prayer, and it is just you and God. And it was being taught also to lay people. His seminar was in Manila. Secondly, the whispering prayer. There is, from the very beginning, from the oldest times, there was a prayer for lay people when they're traveling, they're working, and they just whisper. They just whisper the short invocation to unite them with God even during this work. It was called the Jesus prayer, a very short invocation, the Jesus prayer. And that, unfortunately, has been lost. That's the term for getting that back would be what Jules Kipley said, retrieving that the spirituality of that whispering prayer. But for other contemplative dimensions in the present day, I would use the word not so much retrieval, but a refounding of the mystical tradition and translating the mystical tradition of the old into the present time, to see how you can be a daily mystic rather than being in a religious order. Like I did not know that Father Lawrence belongs to the Maine, John Maine. John Maine. I did not know that, but he was really truly a mystic. However, that mystical tradition is something that is being brought into the present. Sometimes retrieving the mystical tradition, like that Jesus prayer, but also refounding it, as it were, renewing it, and see how it is translated into our space and time today. The second comment, different now from that of Yusuf's question, is I have the impression that in the Muslim tradition, the jihad, greater jihad, has a special season for it. And I think of Ramadan as the special season for an intense greater jihad. And for the Christian, for Catholics, it would be Advent and Lent, when we are told to go against our inner selves, a spiritual combat through fasting, abstinence, but also through charitable works, to go against the inordinate passions of ourselves, corruption, greed, pride, envy, and affections that have been disordered. And that would be a special time for this spiritual combat against our inordinate passions, Advent and Lent. Am I correct in interpreting Ramadan as a special season for the greater jihad? Of course.
Can I say something?
Every day.
Can I say something about that, Cardinal?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I partly agree with you, but I also partly disagree with you.
Okay.
That seasonal characterizations of worship or spirituality only happening in the holy month of Ramadan. I agree with you in that part, but on the contrary, there is also a Quranic verse that says that the best prayer is a continuing prayer, known in Arabic as Salatun Da'imun. It is it can be found, I think, in Surah Taha, one of the surah of the Quran, Salatun Da'imun, that is continuing prayer. You know, all the prayers that we know, in fact, the categories and typologies of prayer have to, I think, have to be delineated. Salah is a form of prayer, but it is the you stand, you do all the bowing and so on. Dua is supplication. You know, the invocation that you mentioned. In dhikr is the remembrance. This is what was mentioned by Father Lawrence. But the impression is these forms of prayer are only done according to certain period of time or in certain places. These are forms of prayer, yes, with their own respective rituals and rules and so on. But that idea of continuing prayer, Salatun Da'imun, is a prayer that is ceaseless, that is constant. In other words, if prayer is our connection with God, then it should not be seasonal. It should not be done just in 5 times per day, or when you need Him and you ask for prayer. You know, and it has to be something that has to start with the heart, that is in deep contemplation, finding that connections, so much so that a person would not be able to forget except that full remembrance of God. So that is a form of prayer that is ceaseless and therefore continuing. Because if you think that a prayer, again, is periodic, then in a sense you have lost your connection with God in certain moments. So we have to struggle to engage in that quest, training our hearts to engage in Salatun Da'imun, in continuous prayer, so that in a sense we will be in full remembrance of God. And according to the hadith, it's actually a Quranic verse. Fadhkuruni adhkurukum. Remember me and I will remember you. So, in other words, if you want to be always in constant presence with God, then you have to be always in constant remembrance with God. And therefore you have to be always in prayer 24/7. So I partly agree with you with the seasonal descriptions of prayer, just as I also partly disagree with you that there is this very a foundational concept of prayer in Islam. And I think even in other, religious traditions, discontinuing prayer, because there is no detachment between the creator and the creature.
Thank you. I see a convergence between continuing prayer in the Islam tradition and our own idea of the cross. We celebrate Lent in order to prepare for the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. And that is the idea of taking up your cross. But Jesus said, and we should remember this as Christians, take up your cross daily. Do your spiritual combat daily. And so I see a convergence between the two.
Thank you very much, Cardinal Camilo and Dean. Okay. Can we go back to Marites, please? Marites?
Thank you, Chiti. My concern really is about the spirituality of interreligious dialogue in the church. I'm not sure if this is the right forum to ask, but to raise this. But since our Muslim brothers and sisters have been bold enough to ask the question about the polarization, you said, Pastor Joel, our practice and our mysticism and the application in our daily life. I would like to also share my experience. As I mentioned earlier, I have been engaged in the field of interreligious dialogue for like 23 years. What got me interested in this is not what the church taught me, or not from the teachings of the church, but from my own quest for understanding, a deeper understanding of my Christian faith. I had to get out of my comfort zone of being the Catholic that my parents, taught me to be a Catholic that way, and my teachers and the catechism. I had to get out of that and explore the spirituality along the Eastern path. I learned meditation from them, from the Buddhist, from the Hindu, from different groups. I was seeking for something deeper in my faith, and came across this group, Anthroposophical Society, and I learned it was strange, but it brought me full circle to my Christian faith. And that's why I studied theology at the Loyola School of Theology and got to experience my faith on a deeper level. And that was what inspired me to engage in interfaith dialogue. But when I got there, I experienced great difficulty. Why? Because I am woman and I'm lay. I experienced that I was regarded even by fellow Catholics and even those in the clergy and the religious, a suspect, and I just felt that in my experience. I entered the field of interfaith dialogue prepared to dialogue with others. So I was prepared to see Muslims and listen to them, Hindu, Buddhist. I was prepared in my whole being that they are other than me, and I was open to that, and that there was something that I could gain from their experience. But I was unprepared for sharing my experience within my own fellow Catholic or Christian faith. So my question is, what is the spirituality of interfaith dialogue in the church? It doesn't seem clear to me. While Pope Francis has been promoting Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, and saying that we have to respond to the call of the times, to open our doors and to reach out, and we are one family among many families, that we are visible manifestations of the invisible God, that we share a common home, we share a common responsibility. But what is it in the teachings of the church today that will encourage fellow Catholics, Catholic Church, to really engage in dialogue, go out without fear? The fear is still there, and that is the greatest challenge that I have, because I have been condemned even within the church. One time I was suspected to be a front of the church of Reverend Moon, Sun Myung Moon of Korea. And I was a pariah. Father Lawrence, that's true. I was a pariah at 207 of the church. I could not even participate in interreligious dialogue among, colleagues or people in the church, no? So that's how I got into grassroots interreligious dialogue. I went to the grassroots because they would not question my identity as a Christian. They were just very happy to welcome me there. And so that's how I thrive in the field of dialogue, being with Muslims and Christians in the grassroots community, because I did not have to show them my ID card that I am a Catholic, and they will ask me or interrogate my faith and so on and so forth. So what I want to ask, in front of our Muslim brothers and sisters, how can you support people, lay people who are on the front lines? We are the frontliners. If there are frontliners of COVID-19, we in the grassroots, women too, are frontliners of interreligious dialogue. And we don't have shields. We are hurt. We are not supported. I feel also sometimes, dismissed. But there has to be a spirituality in the church that can support even the frontliners, and also support the message of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, that we need to open up our doors. What kind of spirituality can support that, can sustain that, can inspire that, so that we can all be unafraid to reach out to others? So I don't know, Father Lawrence, if you have an answer to that. I have also a contemplative streak. That's why I've been practicing meditation for many years, since the early 90s. So that's also one of the reasons why I got inspired to carry on in the field of dialogue, because we are all, coming from one source, and we call this God by different names and experience God in different ways. But in our silence, we have a common safe space to be together. So that's why, Cardinal Quevedo, I don't know if that makes sense, but this is my concern: spirituality in the church of interfaith dialogue, because it's all in the head, but I don't experience it really fully as becoming a reality in our church.
Yeah. Well, first of all, can I just say how inspiring it is what you have done, and the courage that you show in being a pioneer, and that's how things change. It doesn't change from the top down. We're very fortunate to have such a wonderful head of the Catholic Church at the moment in Pope Francis, but it takes more than one great person like him. So he pointed out the three temptations of the church. Temptations that are always there. The temptation to treat the gospel as if it was an ideology, keep in the head, and they sort of attack people for differences of opinion. Ideology, the danger, the temptation of running the church as if it were a multinational corporation. And thirdly, the danger of clericalism, putting clergy up on a pedestal, and lay people are sometimes complicit in that as well. So I think those are three very, very clear temptations that Christianity faces. I think all religion faces it as well. But I think what you have described is the way of the future. And it will be lonely at times, I think, to go out and be a pioneer and to take the risk that you have taken. I think we also need in the church, but also in all religions, to take a second and deep look at the way that we educate our religious leaders, the clergy, the priests, religious, and the imams, and everyone. How do we educate them? Because very often, as you suggest, lay people are more familiar with the contemplative tradition than the clergy. And despite the fact that the clergy have had several years of intense study of theology. So this is a challenge. These are difficult issues for any organization to face, but I think this is where we are growing, where we have to grow. And in response to what you said about the spirituality of interreligious dialogue today, I think to me, it's very clear. You mentioned Laudato Si, the Pope's teaching on the universal crisis of the environment. I think we have the spirituality has to be of the ecology, our outward ecology, our environment, the damage we are doing to our own home and to the sacredness of nature, and the inner ecology, our spirituality. And so I think I think these two have to be in balance, inner and outer ecology. So, and that's why they go together. They go together so well. In our community, we have important. Many of our members are involved in the environmental movement, raising consciousness, exploring how we can change the mind of, and be part of that process of raising consciousness. So, thank you for what you describe, and I think it's the way of the future.
Well, this dialogue is really becoming extremely, extremely interesting. If you don't mind, I would like to open the floor to asking some of the questions that came in from.
There's a comment here by maybe
Yes, please.
That this is a very intellectual discussion. So how can all of this affect the regular lay people?
Anybody in the panel want to answer that?
In answer also to our friend from the grassroots, the spirituality of interreligious dialogue. I hope this will not be intellectual. I read somewhere that when you go into interreligious dialogue, take off your shoes. Take off your shoes because you're entering a sacred space. You're going to be among people whom you might not know, but with those people and you is God. He is the partner in that dialogue. And everyone and you must be aware of God's presence there. Number two, when you enter into the religious dialogue, you must be humble. Yes, you are convinced of your faith, but you are not going to convince the others. Do not proselytize. Listen, be respectful. Listen to what they say and even those that they do not say. Listen carefully with your mind and with your heart. And this humility and knowing God's presence there leads to a conversion of the mind and of the heart. A conversion of the mind and of the heart so that you will be more open to the opinions of others. Open to the opinions of others, you might differ, but you will differ in a friendly way without imposing your own opinion. Respect for others, respect for their human dignity, openness to others, leading to a conversion of mind and heart. I think those are ingredients of the spirituality of interreligious dialogue.
Thank you, Cardinal Quevedo, for a very pragmatic and very down-to-earth answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may add to that, And
Please.
this is also answering a question I saw on the chat about what was the most difficult experience we had when entering into dialogue, into interfaith dialogue. And I agree with Cardinal Orly. The ability to listen, really listen to the other side is prerequisite, because the most difficult, the hardest obstacle I've ever encountered was going into what was supposed to be a dialogue, but some came in with strong positions. It was more like a negotiation where they had their position and they expect you to have your position and you defend your position. But that's no longer dialogue. So I think at its core, the ability to listen, as Cardinal Orly so well discussed, is a critical element. Otherwise, it's not a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Amina. Thank you. Okay. Anybody else wants to add to that?
May I just respond to Cardinal Quevedo very quickly about spirituality? What I meant was, for example, the verse, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Many in our church would think of this as inclusive, exclusive, that it's only Christianity that is the true religion, the way to salvation. But what for me has been very helpful, and that's what I'm referring to as spirituality, is my understanding of this as very inclusive. When Christ said, "I am the way," that means being fully human is the way. So the truth about who we are in this world, our existence, that we are in this world, but we are not of the world. That's the truth. And the life is that there is life in the hereafter. So this is not the end all and the be all of our life. There is, like, we are Easter people. We call ourselves Catholic Christians, Easter people on Easter Sunday. But this is more Catholic than we might be willing to consider Catholic, in the sense of universal, because it is not exclusive to just us. But I think the message is more all-embracing for all humankind, that being human is okay. So that's the spirituality I'm referring to, that has liberated me from my fear. But that is also a concern that I might be regarded as a heretic in the church. You see, so that's another thing. Of course, through the years, I have survived. I did not study interreligious dialogue, but I have survived by listening and practicing heart listening. And conversion is not conversion from one religion to the other, but also conversion of the heart. Most of all, dialogue is heart listening, and that's what we do. We train those who are would like to participate in our projects and initiatives, that we do inner work every time. We do contemplative work, inner work, meditate for 10 minutes, 20 minutes before we start our weekly get-togethers and conversations. So these are all learned from along the way as we wanted to reach out. But my concern about spirituality is, what is the church teaching about Christ Jesus? How can he be a church, a leader, or a spiritual guide for all of us, and not just exclusive to Catholics or Christians? So it's really the basic teachings, and I am concerned that whenever I speak this way, that I may be considered a heretic in the church.
But how can you be a heretic, Maritas? Because the Catholic Church has said that it rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions. And if you meet Catholics who reject that, or deny that, or deny the importance of dialogue, then they are disagreeing with the teaching of the church. They're free to do that, but the official teaching of the church is that we reject nothing that is true and holy in other religions.
Thank you, Father Lawrence.
Who's the heretic? If somebody calls you a heretic, make sure that they're not the one who's the heretic.
That's the first one, yes. Okay, thank you very much. Next, I'd like to take up one question from the audience. For Yusuf or any of the panelists, please, since both Islam and Christianity in the Philippines adapted to or wrapped themselves around the indigenous culture they found here, can we count on a certain Filipino soul or spirit as our underlying common ground for peace? What are the qualities of that spirit, and does it include a contemplative element?
With the permission, may I, Ms. Chike?
Yes.
I think there are three common elements present in Filipino culture that can be identified to both Filipino Muslims and Filipino Christians. The first is bayanihan, the second is pagmumuni, and the third is pakikipagkapwa-tao. If you join all of these three elements, it would address first the need for contemplative prayer, second the need for a collective spirituality, and third the concern that everyone shares in this shared communal spirituality that looks towards contemplative prayer. That's my reflection for that question.
Excuse me, Yusuf, if you don't mind, for our non-Filipino speaking audience, would you please just have a description of or explanation of what each of these commonalities are? You said bayanihan, pagmumuni-muni, and pagkikipagkapwa-tao. Just a short, what do they mean so that they can...
Bayanihan. Okay. Bayanihan simply means the concept of everybody helping each other. Pagmumuni is reflective introspection, and pakikipagkapwa-tao refers to the relationship building of one person to another. I hope it answers.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Another question, please. This is a little bit technical, but how do you define ecumenism within interfaith, specifically with Islam, in the light of Vatican II teachings? It seems Roman Catholicism is exclusive to Trinitarian faith. Please comment.
Yeah, can I make a follow-up to what I said online?
Yes,
this is yeah, I think ecumenism, as far as Islamic tradition is concerned, is at the heart of Islamic teachings. There is a verse mentioned by Father Lawrence, a Quranic verse earlier mentioned by Father Lawrence, when it says that, "O mankind, we have created you from a single male and female, and made you into nations and tribe, for you to understand each other." This is the foundations of ecumenism in Islam. It recognizes the need to spread Islam, but it has to be done in the climate of religious pluralism. The idea being is that our differences should not bar us in celebrating our common humanity. The intention is so that we will fully understand each other. So we are different indeed. Our difference is a vehicle for our understanding. Because what would be a boring world if we are all the same? If we are all black, if we are all white, if we're all yellow, and so on and so forth. If we are all Christians, if we are all Muslims, that would be a boring world. But it would be beautiful if we could exist in a kind of a mosaic, wherein we celebrate our differences and plurality and so on. And this is also shown in various episodes of Muslim-Christian encounters. yes, we had the crusade, that deep animosity between Christendom and Islamdom, but it was just a phase of history. The fact is, there was or there were encounters both on the global stage, in the communal stage, and obviously, I think the most significant to mention was the encounter between Sultan Malik and Saint Francis of Assisi. I think this is the heritage taken off of Pope Francis' visit to Iraq, and even earlier to when he forged the, a kind of a religious understanding with the Mufti of Egypt, the Al-Azhar University. So we should not isolate those phases of religious encounters between Islam and the religious hierarchy in Christianity. And even these days, religious in engagement is as strong, although as noted by Marites, there lies certain contradiction, especially within certain religious tradition, wherein how do we reconcile the fact that we want to engage with the other, but we are not engaging our own flocks? This is I think the questions of Marites. And it's the same with Islam. The tensions and the schism between the Sunni and the Shia, between the Orthodox and the mystics, and so on and so forth, is as strong. And this is not a new phenomenon. This resonates even in those early times, which only shows that in both traditions of Islam and Christianity, there ought to be both inter and interfaith dialogue. And I think an engagement like this, especially with Cardinal Quevedo around and Father Lawrence around, I think this is the way to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
May I say something from the Christian Catholic tradition?
Yes, please.
In the Catholic tradition, ecumenism, the term ecumenism and interreligious dialogue used to be very distinct. They were, ecumenism referred to dialogue with our Christian Protestant brothers and sisters, and the interreligious dialogue were between Catholics and non-Christians, either Buddhists or Confucianists or Taoists or Muslims. Now, however, the words are interchangeable. The use of the words is interchangeable, such that a group of Christians and Protestants and non-Christians and Catholics together would be called ecumenical. And the same thing is true for interreligious dialogue. Whether it is Protestant, it is interreligious dialogue, or together with Muslims, interreligious dialogue. So interchangeable. In the past, it was not so.
Thank you so much, Cardinal. And thank you so much, Professor Wadi. Unfortunately, we've really run over, we've passed our designated end of time. So we would now like to say thank you to all our panelists. It was a very richly vibrant and rewarding and certainly very educational forum for everyone, including myself, of course. Now I'd like to turn over to Father Lawrence, who will introduce us and lead us into the second 5-minute meditation before we close. What, Mito?
For the benefit of others who are not aware of the World Community for Christian Meditation in the Philippines, or even WCCM International, WCCM is in 120 countries. And here in the Philippines, we have about 47 groups meditating either daily, weekly, or twice weekly, twice daily. So we are we have been here for 30 years. Father WCCM is celebrating their 30th year after the founding of Father John Main. They started reaching out, and it became officially the World Community for Christian Meditation. And here in the Philippines, we have so many groups. So yes, let us know who are interested in joining these little groups that we have. And we would be so happy to have you join us. Now, Father Lawrence, can you lead us in a Christian meditation, please?
Yes, thank you, Mitos, and thank you for your work as the national coordinator in the Philippines. As you rightly said, this is the 30th anniversary of the official sort of naming of the WCCM, the World Community for Christian Meditation, in 1991. Although John Main started the first Christian meditation center at his monastery in London in much earlier, in 1975. And 1991 is often also designated as the year in which the World Wide Web began. So I think there's a connection, a hopeful connection between how contemplative networks are forming today around the world, and of course using the internet as we are today to great advantage. So let's take a moment to meditate together in gratitude for the wonderful richness of this time of dialogue and friendship, and really searching and intelligent and loving conversation. I really have learned a lot, and I think it's been very stimulating. So holding that in gratitude in our heart and opening ourselves to the one true and living God who dwells within us and who calls us to be one with each other as God's children. Let's take a few moments to prepare our bodies and our minds and our hearts for this time of meditation, for silence and stillness and simplicity in which we can experience our oneness. First of all, our oneness with ourselves. And so taking a moment to sit upright, to be awake, to be alert, with our back straight, feet on the ground if we're sitting in a chair, hands on our lap or on our knees. So that the body itself we see as a living temple of the divine love and spirit. Relax the muscles of your face, your shoulders, your jaw, so that you can enter peacefully and in a relaxed way into this time of silence. Close your eyes lightly. Maybe be aware of your breathing for a few breaths as we share the breath of life, the gift of life as we breathe in and as we learn to let go, to return this gift to God. And then each of us, in whatever way we enter into the inner room of our heart, let us do so now. In our tradition, and there's a deep resonance, I think, between the Christian and the Muslim way of prayer here, we take a sacred word or phrase, we stay with the same word or phrase. We use the word Maranatha, the language of Jesus, Aramaic, meaning come, Lord. But whatever phrase or word you say, Allah or Maranatha, whatever it may be, We say it gently, without force. We listen to it as we say it, giving it our attention and opening ourselves to the gift of God's love within us. Let's end with these words from the Gospel and from the Quran. Jesus said, "Peace is my parting gift to you, my own peace, such as the world cannot give. Set your troubled hearts at rest and banish your fears. I've spoken these words to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete." And from the Quran, "O mankind, we created you from male and female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other and you may never despise each other. If your Lord had so willed, he could have made mankind one people, but they will never cease to be diverse."
Thank you, Father Lawrence, for hosting your Zoom for this event. And I know you have other places to go. I mean, other seminars and talks, but thank you so much. Chiki, you wanna take over?
I just want to close by saying thank you so much to your dear Father Lawrence. Thank you for gracing this program, this dialogue. Thank you for all the panel members, Yusuf, Professor Wadi, for Amina, for Cardinal Quevedo, and of course for Marites. Thank you so much for the very enriching, educational, and totally immersive experience for all of us. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much too. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father Lawrence.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Your Eminence. Mito said I had to go to another seminar. In fact, I don't. I have to go. I have to go to our midday prayer, which is a 5-minute walk up the hill. But
Okay.
we're going to. I will hold you, and our community here will hold all of you in our heart, in our prayer and meditation now. And we pray that our time together today will bear much fruit and many seeds of contemplation and friendship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Cardinal.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cardinal Quevedo.
Thank you. My prayers go with everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Cardinal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh.
Your son,
Thank you.
Marites. Thank you, Rizal. And Alan, of course.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My
Thank
pleasure.
Thank you,
Thank
Alan.
you, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rizal.
Thank you.
And
you.
thank you,
God bless. Your
Yeah.
Sister
Eminence,
Sonia.
thank you so much.
Sister Sonia.
My pleasure. And thank you
Sister
to everyone.
Sonia.
Sister Sonia, thank you. Yusuf and Kipli,
And Jude.
thank you.
And thank you for the study group that kept on having this weekly we meeting to get this together. Thank you, Chiki, Mariel, Tita, Menchu, Dingay, Edwina,
Marites, Marites.
Gina, and Marites, Africa. So thank you again, everybody.